Okay, so this is going to deal with cycles in terms of reproductive anatomy and physiology. It's straightforward, but it's confusing at the exact same time. So what we're going to try and look at is, well, how do hormones control everything that's going on in terms of gamete production? And obviously this can be paused and whatever else needs to be done. So when we look at the process to make gametes, we call that mitosis and meiosis. Well, technically one of them is really for making gametes. So this first one, I don't know if you can see the pointer or not. When we deal with mitosis, this is a process just to make duplicates. The 2N here means that they are diploid cells, or they happen to have all the total sets of numbers that you turn out to need. So you have all the chromosome 1s, all the chromosome 2s, all the chromosome 3s, all the X's, all the Y's, all the 22s, all the whatever you need. What you start with is what you end with. That's the process of mitosis, and it happens everywhere. When we look at meiosis, it's basically doing mitosis, but doing it twice. So you get one round of mitosis, then you get another round of mitosis. And that's what we call meiosis. The difference between the two is in meiosis, what we're trying to do is cut the numbers in half. So you're going to get only one chromosome 1, only one chromosome 2, only one chromosome 3, only one chromosome 4. So you get one of everything instead of having twos of everything. Why twos? Because you have a mom and a dad, they give you two. Each gives you one, resulting in two. Also, each of these resulting cells, or what we would call a gamete, each of them turns out to be genetically unique, meaning whatever is found in this first one is not looking the same as whatever is found in this second gamete, which is not the same as what's found in the third gamete, which is not the same as what's found in the fourth gamete. They all have the same numbers of chromosomes, and they all have the same type of chromosome, but what's on those chromosomes turn out to be shuffled around, and you're not quite sure what combination comes from where. When you put this into practical use, that's called spermatogenesis or oogenesis. I know it says oogenesis, but it's pronounced o-a, so it's oogenesis. And these two processes occur obviously in either a male or a female in very specific locations. Spermatogenesis only occurs within certain regions of a testicle. Oogenesis only occurs within certain regions of an ovary. The entire process involves meiosis, so you have meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, the two sets of divisions. The major difference is when we look at spermatogenesis, and I know we did this before, what you basically do is you go from being the diploid, so 2N, to haploid, and you get 4 of those, and you do this all within one straight shot. It turns out to be pretty simple, straightforward, and it happens forever. So as soon as the male undergoes puberty, this is what's going on, and it keeps happening until he's no longer alive. Oogenesis is not as simple. Change number 1 would be instead of getting 4 resulting gametes, we get 1 resulting gamete. The reason why it's 1 instead of 4 is we're shoving as much of the cytoplasm as we can into one cell. So basically we're trying to make one massive gamete, and everything else is basically a nucleus. The second thing that sets these apart is the timing. Part of oogenesis takes place inside of the embryo. That's where you just do the first bit of mitosis, and we get what we call the primary oocyte. That is while you're cooking inside a mom. Once puberty hits and you start going through ovulation and your ovarian cycle, you'll finish meiosis 1, you'll start meiosis 2, and then you'll stop. And meiosis 2 stops when ovulation occurs. We complete meiosis 2 only once fertilization happens. Then meiosis 2 finishes, and then congratulations, you finally made an egg. The catch is you made an egg just when it was fertilized. So this is actually a really weirdly drawn out process in humans. It's not necessarily like this in other organisms, but in humans, this is the way it gets played out. The control of all of this stuff deals with hormones, and there are a whole bunch of hormones, so this thing here is a list of some of the hormones that we know to exist inside of the body. I don't know how well it's going to be projecting. It probably might not project that well. But here's the catch when you look at this. We have a hormone, a chemical that's made in one spot, and it targets somewhere else. That's the big deal. A hormone is made somewhere and it targets another part of the body, and with it, it's going to cause some type of long-term effect. Long-term meaning hours, days, months, years, decades, fill in the blank. An example of that would be estrogen and testosterone, which cause your entire anatomy and physiology to shift. But you could also go a little easier, like this first one listed up here is called melatonin. Melatonin is what's used to make you fall asleep. It's the are you awake or are you asleep hormone. So obviously that only lasts for a couple of hours. So these have wide-ranging effects. Most of these you've never heard of, but some of them you have. An example of some of the ones that you probably have heard of, or at least I know you've heard of because I'm the one who told you about them, is, let's just run down the list, angiotensinogen. We have talked about a little bit with angiotensin and raising blood pressure. You have heard of insulin, definitely. I haven't mentioned glucagon, which is the opposite of it. Does it show? It doesn't, but you could have things like, and it would be up here. Anterior, so posterior, pituitary. Vasopressin is the same thing as called antidiuretic hormone, which is something that you've heard of. So, erythropoietin, you've heard of erythropoietin. There are plenty of things in here that you've heard of before. We never talked about hormones. The two main ones that we want to focus in on are these two, obviously, if we're talking about males and females, but there are other hormones involved. I want to walk you now through the cycles of making sperm and egg. I would show you a slide about the cycles that occur when we make sperm, except that there aren't any cycles. It's called the male undergoes puberty, you hit an on switch, and that's that. Females, it's a bit more complicated. So there are two sets of cycles that occur. The first one is what we call the ovarian cycle, and this is obviously what's going inside of the ovary. And what we get are these oocytes, so eggs or pre-eggs, that are trapped in a bundle of cells that we call follicles. And what happens over time is the follicle is going to start to grow. And as the follicle starts to grow, it matures and it changes its name from primary follicles into what we would then call secondary follicles, and they start to develop this little bubble inside that you can actually see, and you saw it when you were looking through the slides. It's called an antrum, which is basically, think of like a blister. It's filled with fluid. And the blisters can keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually we come to what we call a mature follicle, or a tertiary follicle, or a Graafian follicle. So it's as swollen as it can possibly become, and then what happens to blisters? They eventually pop. When they pop, they're going to release the contents on the inside. Well, what's the contents on the inside? We start with the primary follicles, follow the pointer if you can see the pointer. Oh, there it got big. So right there are primary follicles. Inside they have primary oocytes. They start to complete meiosis 1, then we start to go into meiosis 2, and then we have what we call secondary oocytes. Secondary oocytes are then capable of being released. So what we're trying to do is we're making a giant blister to pop out, push out. So this part here that hopefully you can see with the mouse, that part's going to be rupturing. And the fluid on the inside is going to push out the oocyte. It's going to have like a layer of cells and stuff around it that's called the corona. We don't care about that right now. But it's going to kind of pop this thing out. The thing is, we now have a hole. We now have fluid leaking out. We have proteins leaking out that shouldn't be leaking out. This is going to trigger an inflammation response. The result of that is all of the tissue is going to start to become inflamed. It's going to start to swell up. When it swells up, and it's going to become large enough that you can see them with your naked eye, it starts to change in color. There's actually a stage in between, but this isn't showing it, so I'm going to ignore it. So we pop the blister, and it starts to swell up. The color change makes this thing become yellow, and we call that the corpus luteum, because it means the yellow body. So you get this corpus luteum, and what this thing is going to do is it secretes chemicals. All the time, this is all being controlled by chemicals, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Eventually, the corpus luteum is going to go away, and when it goes away, it's going to shrivel up into a scar. And the scar that it turns out to make is going to be white because all scars are actually white in color. And it's actually something that's not listed on here, even though now that I'm looking at this slide, it's like, oh, it looked like a good slide, and it is a good slide, just you can't read any of it. It creates a structure referred to as the corpus albicans, which means the white body. What is it? It's the scar of a ruptured follicle. That's all it turns out to be. So what we have going on, roughly 28 days, even though that's not really right, but let's go with it anyway. We have a follicle, bunch of cells surrounding an oocyte that grow, making a blister. The blister pops. The follicle turns into a giant, massive, swollen yellow body, which eventually deteriorates into a little white mass that we call a corpus albicans. All the while, we're undergoing finishing meiosis 1, we start meiosis 2, we rupture partway through meiosis 2. Meanwhile, somewhere near the ovaries, we have the uterus. And what we have with the uterus, which is a giant muscular bag, are a bunch of layers. The middle part of the uterus, and it's not labeled on here, is called the myometrium. Myo meaning muscle, metrium meaning the uterus. We have an outside layer, and we call that the exome, or the epimetrium. And then we have an inside layer that's referred to as the endometrium, the inside part of the uterus. And what turns out to happen is it goes through, it goes through 3 phases. So menses, proliferation, and secretion. Proliferation is when it starts to grow back. So the endometrium is going to start to grow back. Secretion is when it's actually going to start to swell up. So proliferation, it grows. Secretion, it swells up. What is it swelling up with? Actually with blood. And what it's hoping for is for an oocyte to land on it. Actually, not an oocyte, it's hoping for a fertilized egg to land on it. And if nothing lands on it, for reasons we can show in a video later, what happens is it falls off. And that falling off is referred to as menses. Why do you have the sensation of bloating? Because the way that this thing falls off is the myometrium starts to contract, much like during childbirth, and it's going to contract and end up tearing off the myometrium, or pardon me, the endometrium. It's kind of like if you were to take your hand and put paint on it, and your goal is to remove the paint, but you're not allowed to wash it, you're not allowed to rub it against anything. So how do you get the paint off? Once the paint's dry, if you start to squeeze your hand, it starts to crack and then flake off. That's kind of sort of what you're doing here. Are you really getting fatter? No, you're not. Do you feel bloated? Absolutely. Why do you feel bloated? Because you have a giant muscular bag in the bottom of your abdomen that's contracting and squeezing. So how do we put this together? With hormones, unfortunately. So what we can do is if you look at the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, they match. What we'll turn out to see is menses turns out to correlate with this corpus albicans, with the scar being there, or the start of going through the ovarian cycle. We tend to find proliferation, so what they're calling the follicular phase, but proliferation, the regrowing of the endometrium, turns out to match with the completion of the ovarian cycle. We start secretion, or what this is calling the luteal phase, at ovulation. They seem to match up. And it seems to peak with the corpus luteum. And then once the corpus luteum goes away to the corpus albicans, menses triggers. Well, how does that work? We use it by looking at 4 sets of hormones. We have one hormone here called follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. And what that does is it says, grow the follicle. That's all it does. The follicle is growing. It's also making meiosis continue. So follicle stimulating hormone will make the follicles mature, and it will also cause the oocyte within the follicle to go through and finish meiosis 1 and start meiosis 2. We have this other weird hormone that makes a giant spike, and it's called luteinizing hormone, yellowing hormone, LH. And it seems to spike at ovulation. So is the job of luteinizing hormone to cause ovulation? No, the job of luteinizing hormone is to trigger the corpus luteum. The job of, if I were to sit there and inject you with luteinizing hormone, it's going to make corpora lutea, which is plural for corpus luteum. And we're going to make a whole bunch of these things. Hooray and a hip hip. Well, why do we care? Turns out the corpus luteum secretes a chemical. The name of the chemical is called progesterone. The source of this hormone, progesterone, comes from the corpus luteum. And when we have the corpus luteum, if you notice, progesterone is at its highest. When progesterone is at its highest, notice how the luteal phase, or the secretory phase, is at its highest. The job of the corpus luteum is to get the endometrium ready for the baby, or a potential baby. Well, why would you want to do that? Corpus luteum shows up after ovulation. So we have the potential for a baby now. Corpus luteum shows up after a potential baby, could be in the making. So it's going to be the signal with the hormone progesterone to say, hey, let's get ready for a baby. When the corpus luteum goes away, progesterone goes away. When progesterone goes away, so does the endometrium. So then what happens if there's a baby on it? We'll talk about that one on Monday. There's another trick that's involved. And then obviously, the closer we get to a corpus luteum, we enter in secretory phase again. We have this hormone right here, estradiol. That's estrogen. What's the job of estrogen? It's going to grow the endometrium back. So estrogen also turns out to cycle. And its job is, let's grow the endometrium back. I said this all rather fast. If you need to pause or repeat or whatever you need to do, hooray and hip hip. That's how all these cycles turn out to work to make sperm and egg.